Okay, just as a quick review, I went ahead and start recording for my students who are not attending class live. So far, we have a Chapter 2 lab that was turned in on GitHub, and we have a written test on Chapter 2 that I went ahead and I put its due date for tomorrow. So if you have not done both of those things for Chapter 2, being a lab and a written test, and a homework assignment, right? There's actually 3 things that I've asked for you to complete on Chapter 2. Okay, a homework, a lab, and a written test. Chapter 3, however, because there was so much in the lab, I did not give you a Chapter 3 homework. So there is a Chapter 3 lab assignment and a Chapter 3 written test. Okay, so as far as what have I asked for, that's it so far. Now today's a lab day, and a lot of students are going to work on the lab in Chapter 3. That's kind of where most students are at. If you're a little bit behind, that's okay, but just realize that's where most people are. And then I did open up a Chapter 3 written test. I have here due at the end of class. Just try and get it done as soon as you can. I think I set the due date on Inside Ranking for Sunday. That gives you the time and the flexibility to turn it in later. Tomorrow is the day that we're going to do our first hands-on test. Okay, so I'm going to open up the hands-on test tomorrow, and then we're going to proceed with a lecture on Chapter 4 tomorrow. So again, most chapters are going to have a homework. Most chapters are going to have a lab assignment, and then every other chapter has a hands-on test. So homework, lab, written test for just about every chapter, and then every other chapter we have a hands-on test. So where we left off on the lecture was around slide 24. I'm not sure if I quite covered slide 24, but I thought it would be a good thing to go ahead and cover. And this is Chapter 3. And so let me go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code Chapter 3. And sometimes if you go too fast, you type the exclamation point, you let your computer catch up. Wait for it. Wait for it. There it goes. Okay. So we left off on that slide talking about a div tag. And let's talk about a div tag. Let me open it up. You're going to notice a div tag doesn't really do anything besides cause a line break. And so, a div tag really doesn't do much other than create a section of code that can be used in your structure. Remember, HTML is used for structure and it's used for content. When I'm talking structure, we're talking header, footer, aside, main. Like, these are the different areas of the web page, the structure of the web page, what goes at the top, what goes at the bottom, what goes over to the left, what goes over to the right, what goes in the center. That's your structure. I always call it like framing a house. Where does the bathroom go? Where does the room go? Etc. A div tag is a generic tag that it doesn't have to go anywhere. Like, obviously header goes up at the top, footer goes down at the bottom, div goes wherever you want it. Okay, and before HTML5, you would see a lot of things like this: div with an ID of header, right? And by the way, that was a little Emmett quick code. So div pound header, and then you hit tab, and it fills that in, right? And so this was the old way of creating a header. Now, ever since the new HTML5, new 10, 12 years ago, we just have a header tag. The reason why the header tag is better than div ID of header, well, there was really on some websites, people would call the top area the header, other people would call it the top. Right? There was just no standard way of saying that this is the tag to put the content where all it belongs up at the top. And so HTML5 came along and they fixed that with header and footer and main and nav. And these tags are called semantic tags, meaning they describe the content that goes in them, whereas a div is just a generic block level element. It doesn't really belong at the top or the side. You just put it wherever you want. And it is still pretty common to have div with an ID of left area or something like that, where you can still give div IDs. Divs are not gone, they have not vanished, they are still very commonly used. But if you can use a built-in semantic tag like header, you should always use header over div ID of header. And again, just a reminder, this is a div. All of these tags, header, like literally header, main, and nav, like there's really, they don't do anything special other than put everything in a block. Like look, they all look the same, right? So functionally, the header does the same exact thing as the footer, which does the same exact thing as the nav, which does the same exact thing as the div ID of top. All they do is cause line breaks because they are block level elements. You know, where you start getting into, well, then what's the difference? Well, header is supposed to go to the top. And so when we learn CSS, we're going to learn how to position things and how to get things off to the top and off to the side and at the bottom and all this kind of stuff. So that's the purpose, is that these semantic tags or these structural tags just have a place where they're supposed to go in the structure of the document. Okay, now the other thing is there's a generic tag called span. And span is, if div is a generic block level element, again, remind me, block meaning what? What does a block level element mean? Someone in the classroom? My question is, what is a block level element?
Doesn't it causes a line break?
Perfect. Block level elements cause line breaks. Therefore, inline elements are the opposite, meaning they do not cause line breaks, right? So there's a tag called span, and if a div is a generic block level element, a span is a tag that does not cause a line break. It's a generic inline element. And the purpose of a span tag is I could say, oops, I got the wrong hotkey there. Let me do a style tag, and we're going to learn some CSS this week. And this turns out that we're going to write some CSS in the head of our document here. And I'm going to say paragraph span. And you can see I'm able to target a word inside of a paragraph that does not cause a line break. And so by wrapping this in a generic tag called span, I can now target that tag, that span tag, and make it font size bigger, right? Or do whatever I want to do. And so in summary, div tags are generic block level elements. Span tags are generic inline elements. Remember, there are other inline elements. What other inline elements have we learned?
Anchor tags, image tags.
Anchor tags, image tags, those are good examples of inline elements. Strong tag is another. Notice this is an inline element. It doesn't cause a line break. So things like emphasis, EM, emphasis tags, strong tags. Remember, like the super and the sub. Emphasis does italics.
I got a question.
Please.
So, like, say you have multiple paragraphs, and with CSS, you're just trying to target like one paragraph. How would you do that if they're all the same, like, written code?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to do that. If I had another paragraph here, probably the easiest way, the easiest way on the surface to give this an ID of second paragraph, right? And then you can come up in the CSS and target second para, and you can see.
Got
Okay, now that by no means is that the easiest or necessarily even best way of doing. That's not necessarily the best way. It is probably the easiest way. Okay, and I'll, as we get into this more, I'll explain some other ways. Okay. All that's good and fun. Let's go ahead and clean this up, kind of back up. The next thing I want to talk about is links. More specifically, not links, paths. To understand paths, you have to understand that everything on a computer is in a folder, right? I mean, if you kind of click around here, the root of my computer is my C drive. Like there's nothing behind the C drive. The C drive is considered the root. And then I can go into this users folder, EA Gudmested, desktop, actually I think in documents, GitHub. And so this is the path that I'm kind of exploring here to get to my repository. And so you can kind of click up in this path here and you see the full path to get to my repository, then to my homework, then to my chapter 3 homework, and look at that giant path that we've navigated on my computer. Okay. Right now the website that I'm coding is here though. And so you would say that the root folder for my website, where is the homepage located? Well, the homepage is located in this chapter 3 homework folder. So you would call that the root. Okay, that is where the homepage exists. So the root of my website right now is index.html. And once you have the root defined, then you can go down folders, you can go up folders. So for example, if we're going to talk about pathing, I might have an images folder. Okay, this is very common. Now, from the root, right, images is called a subfolder, right? Meaning it is beneath the root. Meaning I would have to double click on images and you can see that images is lower in the hierarchy from the root. Okay, so root folder and then subfolder is images. So then the question becomes, well, how do I code something to an image, for example, that's in the images folder? And in order to do that, well, the first thing I need to do is have an image. So I'll just go to the Google machine and search for triathlon is my hobby, and I'll steal on this image, and I need to save this image. And so you got to get familiar with, by the way, people who do triathlon, they dress in funny outfits, right? So if you didn't know that, it's kind of, it is what it is. So let's save this image. Save image as. Okay, so now I need to save this image. Now where you save this image, and there's a couple steps here that are really important. Where you save this image is going to be in that images folder, right? So keep in mind, you just don't want to save it in your downloads. The downloads folder on your computer has nothing to do with your website. Okay, your website has a root folder, and it really, anything else on your computer, these other files on your computer are not relevant to your website. Okay, so you need to, when you download an image, you need to save it into your root folder and maybe into a subfolder. And so remember, this was in documents, GitHub, student repos, EA Gudmested, homework chapter 3. Now I'm going to save this into my images folder. So now we have the right place that we're saving it, right? So I'm just going to call this triathlon and we'll save it as a PNG. It's important to notice here that our image has an image type. The image type is PNG. The file name is triathlon. Okay, so you could save it and you can see it saves as triathlon.png. More specifically, we're talking about relative paths here. So now I'm going to code the image, and you're going to notice I have an images folder. So what I need to do, my source attribute, keep in mind the source attribute for an image is where you give it the file name and the file extension. But now that we're coding it in a subfolder, we have to give it a path relative to the file that we're coding. We're coding the home page, index.html. So relative to index, images is a subfolder. Because index is in the root. Index is in this chapter 3 homework. So our source has to include the path and the file name and the file extension. So how do you code a subfolder path? Well, it's actually images slash. Let me type that, images. And so what we're looking at when I type images slash, this is just saying go into a subfolder called images and look in that subfolder. That's what the / means. So this now says look inside the images subfolder slash, and it actually puts in the triathlon.png. And now you could see the image shows up. Okay, so the first thing to code a subfolder, you simply give the subfolder folder name followed by a /. Okay, and so that's how you go down. That's how you go down a directory structure. Now, very commonly, this path is relative to the file that you're coding. Maybe there's another folder, and I can create a new folder in Visual Studio as well. And I'm just going to make another folder called Other Pages, and I'll make a new file called page2.html. Okay, so now Other Pages is in the root. You can kind of go back here. You can see it created this folder called Other Pages, and there's my page 2. So now I want this page 2 to get to my images. And so let's put an image tag. So what do I need to do here? I actually need to go up a directory. I need to go up one directory and then down into the images directory. So to go up a directory, it's actually like that. // from anyone who's ever been at a command prompt, when you change directory cd ... that takes you up a directory. So it kind of reminds me of the old DOS days. And cd ... takes you up a directory, so .. / takes you up a directory, and then Visual Studio Code's pretty savvy. It's going to say, hey, wait a minute, when I go up a directory, this is what I see. Well, there's your images and there's your triathlon, right? There's another way of coding this. Okay, so now I'm on page 2 and I still have access to my image. Okay, there's actually another way of coding this, and it's like this. Now what this / does, this is called, this says go to the website root. So the / at the beginning of the path says to go to the website root. And you can see that still works. Okay, so this is actually kind of nice, because if I were to have another subfolder in here, we'll call this more pages, right? So now I've got inside here page 3.html. So now I'm in another folder, right? So if you follow along, I've got other pages, more pages, and we got page 3. Okay. By the way, this is all for organizational purposes. I will tell you, folders and files and websites. You know, you need to organize your files. And so these folder and file structures can get complex. That's actually kind of common. And it makes it pretty easy then when you've got this /. It says basically go to the website root. Okay, that's actually pretty easy way, and then we could just say, okay, there's our triathlon image. Now, if we didn't have this / image, what would we have to do? We'd have to do .. That's going up one directory. .. Now we're up 2 directories, and we're at the root. Now we're going down into the image, and there's our triathlon. The only problem that I have with this is that the root is kind of a relative thing in itself, and that the root is ultimately configured by software. Because we're in Visual Studio Code and we have this Chapter 3 homework folder open, that becomes the root. In other words, Visual Studio sets the root by opening this folder. Remember that one of the first things we did is we opened a folder here. This folder that we open configures the root. And so if you configure your root and it's not the same as the folder that I open, then this will not work. The root will not work. So if my only ask is that if you use root pathing, which I'm cool with, just keep in mind that I'm going to be grading this on my computer, and I'm going to need you to set your root to the homework folder or the lab folder that, you know, that we're grading or that we're completing. Okay? So, in other words, the root on your computer needs to be the same as the root on my computer. The same thing takes place when you deploy a website. When you deploy a website, like right now we're building a website, and ultimately we're going to put it on a web server, and that web server is going to host your website so that it's always online. Well, you're going to have to configure that web server whatever the root is. So just like, you know, here this becomes our root folder, you got to make sure that whatever web server you put this website on, that your root is the same. Otherwise, all of your pathing will break. Okay, now I'm configuring pathing to images. It's also worth noting that our pathing, our paths, other pages / page 2. Links have to have relative paths as well. So I'm on my home page, and I'm coding to page 2. Now I'm on my home page and I'm coding to other pages / more pages / page 3. Okay, so images have what are called relative paths, and links have relative paths. Okay, and they're not the only things. There's other files that have relative paths, but this is the gist of it. And kind of the same thing here. If I'm on page 3 and I want to go back to the home page, I could just go /. Keep in mind, this is a root relative. This says go to the root and get to the index, the home page. And if I launch, this is page 3. This is page 3 that I'm looking at, and I can click on home page and it takes me back to index. Yes, sir.
Is there a difference, like when you have links to files to download? Say, like you have on your web page, you have links to files on like an FTP server or something like that. Is that any different?
Yeah, good question. So if you have, and there's a few tricks here, but if you're going to link, just say to a PDF, and you're going to let the user download a PDF. Let me see if I can do this example real quick. Like if I go into my downloads, I've got a Chapter 2 lab PDF, and I'm going to drag that into here. Now let's see. Okay, so I've got this PDF file, and I want to create a link to download this PDF. And so let's go ahead and do that. So let's do that from the home page, since it's really in the same directory. I'm going to create an anchor tag, and the path is going to be, let's see, HTML. I'm on the home page, right? cho2 lab.pdf. Download the lab. And literally you just create a link to the PDF document, and you click on it, and well, that's going to open it in the browser, and then you can click on download. Now there is an attribute, HTML download attribute, and this is kind of, this is a Boolean attribute, and so this is pretty decently supported across web browsers. And so you can see right on this link, you just mark it as download. And so let's go ahead and just give it the download attribute. And it does not require any values. Okay. And now if I run that, let's see if this is, see how it just straight downloads it. Okay. Good question. And that has pretty good support, that download attribute. Now keep in mind, again, just a review from last week, we have the anchor tag, and we have, for example, the image tag. This is called the alt attribute, the source attribute, the href attributes. Attributes typically have a very common convention, and that's the name of the attribute followed by an equal sign followed by quotes. Okay, and so there's a value in those quotes, and so that's an attribute convention. However, there are some attributes like this download attribute that is Boolean, and what is assumed here is kind of like this download equals true, and that's just assumed. Anytime you just have a Boolean attribute, it's assumed to be equals to true because by default it's not set to true. It's just you're not downloading it. Very cool. So getting relative pathing right takes some practice, but I think we covered it pretty well here. The last thing to say is that this was all called relative paths. There is another absolute paths, are links to external resources. And so if you like create a link to HTTP, they typically begin with HTTP or HTTPS ://www.rankin.edu. Okay, this is still a link, but it's going to take you external to your site. It's going to take you to someone else's website. It's pretty good practice that when you do this, you set a target equal to, and the convention here is _blank. And what that's going to do is it's going to open up the Rankin website in a new tab. And the _blank, you know, they give these like these, what is _blank? Well, for now, it's just a way to get it open in a new tab. And it's very conventional, but you could also, I mean, I think this is not conventional, but it still works in a new tab. Okay, the convention with your target attribute is _blank. Pretend I never even said that you can put anything else in here. Just put _blank for now. I think when you give the target some sort of value here, I guess technically maybe you can use your JavaScript to kind of work with this, but you're really just best off using blank. These are all relative paths, meaning these are resources relative to the page that you're coding. Okay, these are paths relative to the home page. This is a path relative to page 2. These are paths relative to page 3. Okay, they're talking about paths that are relative to the page that you're currently coding. Okay, we covered all that fun stuff. Covered all that, covered all this. Very important for people who are, blind, so accessibility, and search engine optimization guideline here. So the text that we're using for our links, where is the text for our links? Well, the text for our links are right here, in between the anchor tags. This is what the user sees. But also, this is what the screen reader will read, right? So page 2 is actually a terrible link identifier because it's not very descriptive. What's on page 2? Is this a page about triathlon? Is this a page about ranking? What is this a page about, right? So instead of just calling, your links page 1, page 2, page 3, you need to, for screen readers, for people who are blind and they want to use your site, it's really important to make these links, the text of the links, descriptive, okay? And the same thing for search engines. If Google is going to understand all the different pages on your site, they are going to want to understand these links. And if they say, okay, well, this link is about Evan Gudmestead doing triathlon, right? Something like that. Triathlon Evan Gudmestead. Triathlon of Evan Gudmestead. Something that is a descriptive link that a search engine can begin to understand your page. And again, if SEO stands for search engine optimization, in other words, Google needs to understand your pages. This is another place where you could consider putting keywords that you've done in keyword research. Okay, if you're trying to optimize your site for certain keywords, then to say that this is an entire page about that keyword is a pretty good idea. Okay, as long as you're not faking out Google, right? Doing Google bomb or whatever that's called, right? So we've covered lists, no big deal on lists. We've covered definition lists. This is all stuff we've done at this point. We've talked about images, okay? Giving this, now this again, this is just saying go into the images subfolder. Very common image formats supported by most browsers are PNGs and JPEGs and GIFs, and they're kind of, we do have a whole chapter on this, but it says learn more about JPEGs, PNGs, and GIFs, which image format to use and when. So I have a pretty good blog here about, and then even a TLDR. Use JPEG, too long, didn't read. Right, so if you just want the summary, use JPEG format for all images that contain natural scene or photography. Use PNG for any image that needs transparency. Use GIFs for animations. Like that's the TLDR. I'll go ahead and paste that in Discord. Mentioned this earlier, but when you have an image for accessibility purposes, again, people who are blind or maybe even colorblind who can't, colorblind is pretty common, disability, you want to code the alt attribute that describes the image. And if you have an image that's just for decoration, meaning it's just to look pretty, then you should leave an empty alt tag. So if this was just for decoration, it really doesn't do anything besides make the page look pretty, then just leave the alt tag like that, so Google can understand that this is for decoration. Okay. Our web pages are still ugly. Look, thankfully, this week we're going to get into CSS, and our websites are going to be less ugly. They're still going to be fairly ugly. All right. That's a nice short lecture. I'm going to go ahead and stop the tape here. Any questions before I stop the tape? Stop the tape. All right. We'll go ahead and get into lab.